lunch. So now that we are back, our first presenter post-lunch is going to be Voltas. And so you have the floor through 1:30.
Great. Can everyone hear and see me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. I will share my screen here. Great. My name's Ethan Barquest. I'm a senior consultant with Verdant. We are the ones who performed the LIP analysis on behalf of Voltas. Go ahead and jump in here with the agenda. Our first little bit here is just a little background on Voltas, a description of the participants and portfolio that were covered under the LIP, and then a brief kind of overview of the ex post methodology followed into the ex post impacts, and then the same for ex ante. And I'm going to invite Matt Hempworth if he's on the line to go over this slide. Otherwise, I'll continue.
Hi, Ethan. Yeah, I'm here. Great. So yeah, a little background on Voltas. We are a demand response provider across North America and have been since 2016. We currently participate in every wholesale market providing demand response where we're available in North America. So we have a track record of many varied successful DR programs in that history. For California specifically, we entered CBP and BIP in 2019 via or with PG&E. We also participate in BIP and SCE territory. Beginning in 2020, we began participating in the demand response auction mechanism program, again, both in PG&E and SCE territory. And we also now in 2022 are providing RA to some CCAs via bilaterals, and that's RA that was procured in last year's LIP. And yeah, we're additionally a scheduling coordinator. Just because of the timeline for when we entered these programs, we have a limited portfolio and event history in California prior to 2020. But we're actively engaged in many of the above programs presently and moving forward as well. So thank you, and let me know if you have any other background questions that I can help with.
Great. Yeah, and one thing to add there about the 2020 timeframe, that has some limiting effects on what we're able to do to account for, say, COVID. It is something we explored, but we couldn't really establish with our participants what the 2019 pre-COVID conditions would be. So I know that DRAM is exempt from LIP and CBP is covered under other LIP submissions. This analysis here uses those participants to provide what would be incremental to those programs. So just a heads up that this is incremental. But what we have here are kind of the high level summary of events and program characteristics for Voltas's participation in the California portfolio as it pertains to this LIP. For PG&E DRAM, there was 51 event days over the year in 2021 with 87 dispatches. The way we're defining a dispatch is, an event that has the similar event start and end times for the resources dispatched. So depending on the location or the resources, a event day could have more than one dispatch if a certain set of resources were, say, dispatched from 4 to 6 p.m. and then another set from 6 to 8 p.m. or something along those lines. For CBP, less frequent events, 9 over the event window, or event season, I should say, rather. And then for SE DRAM, there was 14 events called throughout the year. The vast majority of these events were 1 or 2 hours in duration. We'll get into how we adjust for that in our ex ante impacts here to account for the fact that resource adequacy is needs to account over those longer event durations. There were a total of 413 participants enrolled in these programs for PG&E. For SE, there's 483. The participant event hours is highlighting the kind of variability of when events were dispatched. So similar to some of the other programs that presented earlier, there isn't necessarily a set of days where we have, like event hours for every participant in these programs. And so the participant event hours represent the number of participants in each dispatch multiplied by the duration or the number of events. So for example, hour ending 17 for PG&E DRAM had 846 participant event hours, which means that, for that hour, throughout the year, there was 846 participants participating in that hour on aggregate across all events. And then just kind of, highlighting here on the right, the number of event hour dispatches for each program in each month. Voltas's portfolio, at least the participants covered under this LIP, belong to a variety of non-residential industry segments, the largest being industrial and retail. There's a number of municipal participants as well in both PG&E and SCE, and 49 agricultural facilities in PG&E's territory as well, and then a handful of education, commercial, and other segments as well. The response types are kind of a blend between scripted, which is a fully automated response, manual response, which is someone manually going in after being notified of an event to dispatch, and then engineering integration, which is somewhere in between those two. Great. So for the ex post analysis, similar to last year, we did individual regression models for every participant. We've explored using other methods for regression analysis, but the reason we ultimately end up with individual regression models is data availability. The data for every participant is a little different in terms of what days are available or where we have data for given months. There's event variability, that's highlighted especially for PG&E DRAM, where we have, on a given day resources dispatched for different event windows. And then also just given the participant characteristics, there's a lot of load variability between especially those industrial segments. It also allows for kind of the reporting granularity. We can sum up and aggregate those impacts in whatever way we need to. So there's a little bit of ease in terms of reporting for this as well. We set up a set of candidate model specifications under kind of a few different scenarios. Summer weekdays and winter weekdays. So depending on the time of year, the candidate models for selection were designed slightly differently, largely to incorporate differences in, say, weather sensitivity. For example, cooling degree days and the baseline, modeling isn't necessarily appropriate for winter months where, say, heating might be the primary reason for differences in day-to-day load. So we take that set of candidate models and we run it through on a set of proxy event days. We selected 5 days in kind of each quarter to test models on. And then for the summer and winter models, we end up selecting the best fitting ones in terms of MAPE and CV RMSE. MAPE is the mean aggregate percent error, and then CV RMSE, the coefficient of variation of the root mean squared error. And then, the one that minimizes kind of the error and bias ends up being the model that we select for the ex post analysis. So one of the items required under the LIP is an average event day. And so this is the average event day as presented in the table generators. You'll see here in the event hour bands, there's kind of different levels of shading. So the more opaque or the thicker, darker the event hour band is, the more frequent that an hour was an event hour. And so what ends up happening with kind of this way of presentation is you end up blending participant load shapes that are not necessarily, dispatched for a given hour. For example, hour 20 there, despite being kind of the largest impacts, is kind of diluted in a sense because it is frequently not a event hour on that day. For example, we selected, let me back up. So in order to kind of minimize this dilution, we selected only events that had hour ending 19 and 20 to represent the average event day. But because of this dilution, you kind of end up averaging non-impacts with load impacts as well. So, we end up for PG&E DRAM seeing a 13% load reduction, even though in hour 20, we kind of see larger impacts there. And the same goes for CVP with roughly 18% load reduction. A more appropriate way to kind of look at this is looking at the average event hour reduction. So this is for PG&E across both CVP and DRAM. Those impacts, if events were on the same day, are averaged together here. And then we also removed event days not meeting the 15-15 reporting rule here. But the point being is, depending on what resources are dispatched, you kind of see large differences in the average participant impact, right? And so the scale here kind of makes some of these impacts look smaller, but we quite frequently see, average participant load reductions that are above what that average event day impact would be, right? This is a little more evident here with kind of the SCE impacts, right? So we kind of get to see both of these plots side by side here. So for SCE, we selected events that had hour ending 17 to represent the average event day. So this would be across the entire year. It's also the hour where the vast majority of events were dispatched for that hour, right? But if you look at the summer months, summer event days on the left here, so kind of those average hourly per capita impacts that are above 20 and 25, they tend to happen right here, kind of July and August. Those are, greater than 25 kWh in load reduction. But when you look at the average event day, you can kind of see this dilution effect where we see, 12.8 kWh in load reductions. The point being here is the average event day when resources aren't typically dispatched at the same time can be a little misleading. And so I think everyone probably is a little bit aware of that on the evaluation side. But it kind of has relevance when you're starting to look at the ex ante impacts here. But anyway, yeah, so this is kind of what the average events look like for SCE DRAM. If we look at kind of the average impacts statewide across the portfolio for, the average event hour across all events in 2021 for the entire both PG&E and SCE kind of resources. We see 35.5 kWh per hour in load reductions. There's a number of segments here that are not included because of the 15-15 rule. And we also lumped, for this slide, PG&E and SCE together just so we could make sure that we have some of these less frequent segments in here. But you'll notice that the largest load reductions come from manual response types, and then from the agricultural sector as well. So agriculture is exclusively encapsulated by PG&E. In this case, there were no SCE agricultural industry participants. And then there is some sort of, I guess, correlation between the response type and industry types as well. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the overall ex-ante approach. You know, what we end up doing is modifying those ex-post models to come up with an average event hour, an average event hour load reduction that is weather normalized across the various weather scenarios included in the analysis. One thing that we did to account for the fact that most of the events were under 2 hours or 2 hours or under in duration was we brought in some additional Voltas resources from New York's commercial system relief program, which has similar participant characteristics to these California programs. However, their dispatches were generally 4 hours or longer in duration. So we brought those guys in to help develop some D-rate factors, and as well as look at time of day effects to see if there was any sort of adjustments that we would need to account for, you know, for the fact that the RA window is a longer duration than what the resources were dispatched for in 2020. One of the things we also looked at is COVID-19. We don't really have a great base year for pre-COVID conditions. So we kind of looked at, you know, what the differences between loads were in 2020 and 2021 for those like participants, and we didn't see statistically significant differences. And so we did not apply any sort of COVID-19 impact, but we did look at that. And then those per capita impacts are then aggregated up based on the participant forecasts. So I'll spend a little more time talking about the long duration adjustment factors. This is where I think we'll get a little heavy on the methods, given that this is not something that's necessarily, you know, always incorporated into the load impact studies. But what we end up doing is taking the, we normalize the impact for those participants in the CRSP to a % load reduction. And then we ran them through a pretty simple linear regression where we have a beta hat 1 value, or the event hour value, that corresponds to what hour of the event it was, whether it was the first, second, third, or fourth consecutive event hour. And then also the hour itself. So, you know, was the event hour an hour ending 17, 18, 19, etc. And what we found is a pretty, you know, modest trend, but it was a trend that made sense, right? So the beta hat 1, the beta 1 values for each hour corresponds to basically a decrease in % load reduction, right? So the beta 1 estimates, for example, 0.41 an hour for hour 2 corresponded to a 4.1% reduction in the percent load reductions. And then corresponding for hour 3 and 4, we see a trend that's roughly 3.5% reduction in load impacts over the event window or the duration, right? And so we then just, for the 5th hour in the ex-ante piece, we extrapolate that. We didn't have hour 5 in the model, but there's a linear trend. So we continued that trend down to 8.6. So ultimately what we do is the impacts for each, that overall average impact gets derated, or an adjustment factor is applied to it. So we multiply those impacts by the derate factors in each relevant hour. So obviously the first event hour doesn't have any sort of load reduction. We take that as the first hour, there's no event fatigue. And so that value is 1.
Can I ask a real quick question on that?
Certainly, yes.
If you go back to your model, were the event hours and the hours, were those dummy variables, or were you fitting a linear, or were they linear related? Like the event hour could be 1, 2, 3, right? And then it could be a linear. It could be linear.
Yeah. So
which were you doing? Were they dummies for both the event hour and the hour variables?
We treated them as categorical variables. So in essence,
Perfect.
they become dummies. So so in other words, this is the event hour was a categorical. Both of them were categorical variables. So we end up with beta 1 and 2 estimates for all of those sort of categories, except for hour 1, which is captured in the intercept.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I guess I should point out for we did look at the time of day effect, so that beta 2 value, and there wasn't any sort of statistically significant estimate that came out that made intuitive sense. We did see some hours where we would hypothetically, if we took that estimate, we would adjust the impacts upwards, but we decided not to make any upward adjustment to the impacts, only to derate them. Voltas provided us with their ex-ante forecast, participant forecasts for 2022 through 2023. Again, the year of interest here is 2023. They provided us with kind of overall numbers. We distributed out the kind of distribution, or assume the distribution of participants would look the same for future years, at least for 2023. Obviously, next round of this, we'll get a different participant forecast, and kind of those numbers will get trued up as time progresses. Regardless, in 2023, they're expecting, Voltas is expecting 953 participants, and then steady growth up to roughly 2,200 by 2032. So this is what, when we estimate our per participant or per capita impacts, this is what the month of August looks like. On the left, we have the system peak day. On the right, we have the typical event day, as defined by those weather scenarios. Again, by 1 in 10 CAISO and 1 in 10 utility, and then 1 in 2 for those as well. For under 1 in 2 utility on a system peak day, PG&E's impacts are a little under 80 per participant. Again, that's a pretty big difference from what the ex post average impact was. And the reason for that is we're assuming that all participants are dispatched here, and there's a number of large participants that are dispatched in a way that they kind of we're not able to present them here because they break the 15-15 rule, given that, just the sheer size of them. And also we're not sort of dealing with the dilution effect like we brought up in those ex post plots. But what we also present here is the unadjusted impact versus the derated impact. So that dark green line is the participant, the average impact that's being used here, right? So this is the average across all hours in the RA window. So that derated impact, if you looked at the first hour only, would look very similar to that unadjusted impact. In hour 5, it would be diluted further than what's presented here. So you kind of end up with this middle ground dilution in terms of the way the data is presented here. For SCE, we see much smaller impacts per participant, little under 30 under the 1 in 2 utility condition for the derated impact. And so we then multiply those out by the participant forecasts. We've presented here the average aggregate August system peak event hour reduction. So this is the average hour. Again, because of those derate factors, they're going to get slightly different impacts in each hour. But this one, is kind of the average across the RA window. For 2023, under utility 1 and 2 conditions, we're forecasting that Voltas will be able to provide 46.7 megawatts of load reductions statewide. When I say statewide, that's PG&E and SCE's territories. The bulk of that is in PG&E, with roughly 2/3 of that load impact there, and then for SCE, roughly that remaining third, that's 16.2 megawatts. Okay. And that's what I have for today in presenting the load impacts here. I don't have a recommendation slide. I kind of echo some of the points made earlier today about the vintage of the load impacts and some of the things that are required in their relevancy for DRPs in particular. I'll open it up to any questions.
Yeah, hi, this is Alok, Energy Division. Can you hear me, Ethan?
Yeah, I can hear you great. Yep.
So the ex post analysis appears to be done on is based on customers participating in DRAM and capacity bidding programs, right? But the extrapolation you're doing is for ex ante. The ex ante extrapolation you're doing is for customers that would participate in CCA contracts, presumably, or potentially other RA contracts with IUs. I guess I'm trying to understand on what, did you look at whether it's reasonable to extrapolate the performance for customers in CCA contracts and look at the program design similarities or not?
Yeah, we didn't look at that. I will say, Matt, please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but it's my understanding that the participants that were included in the ex post would potentially move from, say, DRAM or those IOU programs to be able to participate in other RA stuff given the opportunity. Am I characterizing that correct, Matt?
It would likely be a combination of new customers as well as some potential existing customers for whom they might prefer, to move from, say, a capacity bidding program to an RA program, if that program characteristic was a better fit for their operation. But as to the greater question, or the original question from Alok, as to the applicability of taking results from the programs that we're currently in and applying them to a resource adequacy program, I think this I would suggest is a limitation of the existing LIP process, wherein if you have not participated in RA in the past, you obviously will not have those customers to reference. So you get yourself in a chicken and egg problem, right? Where only an entrenched player who already has been participating in RA could presumably continue participating, unless you make your best effort to take like programs and apply appropriate D-rate factors like we did in this case to make it what we think is a pretty good comparison.
Well, I mean, the D-rate factors, I appreciate that analysis and taking into account weather and duration and all. And I also understand the LIP limitation as far as moving into a new program. I guess what I was wondering about was, we don't have visibility into whatever the program design might be under CCA contract, but as an evaluator, you could be looking at the anticipated program design and think about to what extent those design elements are different from capacity bidding or DRAM, and whether that might influence the customer's response. So, but I guess it sounds like you didn't really have an opportunity to look at that.
Yeah, I think, part of that problem too is also schedule. It's a pretty aggressive time frame for analysis as well. So, we tried to do as much as we could with the time given as well. But I certainly hear what you're saying, and it's food for thought for next time.
Okay, and I just have one more question. So it seems like the basis of the extrapolation was the per capita analysis on the expos going to per capita ex ante times enrollment. So is your thought that the distribution of customers within the data set, they're fairly similar, that the per capita methodology is workable? Or, if the data set isn't that large, right? So to the extent the customers are very different from each other, you could do a per customer modeling and extrapolate based on that, right?
Yeah, and so let me know if I'm not answering your question. We received the participant forecast, and with the information provided and what is known by Voltas, it didn't necessarily allow for a distribution that for these participant characteristics. So we had to kind of make the assumption that going forward, the distribution of participants would look the same. Had we had greater insight into some of these forecasted participant characteristics, we would certainly have accounted for or weighting, so to speak, appropriately based on that distribution. But we assumed like distribution based on the forecast that we have. Yeah.
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we move on?
Is anyone monitoring chat for questions? I see a question from Kyle Kettler in chat.
Ah. Yes, I see the question from Kyle. I will say it out loud. How do California participants differ from New York participant population?
Yeah, Matt, I'm gonna hand that one back over to you. Yep.
Yeah, certainly. So the reason that that program in New York specifically was chosen to help build a D-rate factor off of is because that program specifically was looking at commercial and industrial customers across a variety of verticals, similar to our customers in the DRAM and CPP that we were basing our analysis off of for the ex-ante analysis. And with a with the benefit of having mini events and mini events of long duration that we could compare across there. Those individual sites were not mapped by industry type just because that was not available in the New York data set. But we know from the customers in them that they, were just because of the nature of the program, were also commercial, industrial in nature. So overall, the population should be quite similar.
I have a question about that as well. My understanding is that New York demand response utilizes a lot of backup generation, like fossil fuel backup generation, to support demand response programs, whereas California has the commission has a prohibited resources policy to limit and to make sure that demand response isn't using fossil fuel backup generators to provide demand response. So that seems like an issue that could make those two populations very dissimilar in how they're going to respond to event and their reliability. Do you have any comment on that?
I would have to ask our New York markets manager if I don't believe that is a program. In fact, let me look real quickly. I might be able to see certain programs in New York. Backup generation may be allowed, but not in all of them. And my understanding is that this is one of those programs where either A, backup generation was not allowed, or B, if generation was allowed, it was only under the a stipulation where it would be clean generation. In other words, the air being emitted would have to have fewer carbon emissions and local pollutants than the air being ingested. So let me check quickly, though. And if I can't find it quickly, you can always follow up over email, but that is my that's my recollection off the top of my head, though I will concede that I am not the manager for that specific program.
Yeah, and we can follow up later on that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not finding it right in front of me, so we can always follow up over email.
All right. Thank you very much. We're out of time and we have got to move on to our next presenter and final demand response provider of the day before we get to SCE, and that is Sunrun. Take it away.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, I can. You're all set.
Perfect, thank you. So good afternoon, this is Yang Yu. I'm the Senior Manager of Grid Services at Sunrun. Glad to be here to present Sunrun 2023 Load Impact Product Analysis to the group. I realized we didn't include a lot of technical details in these slides, but I'm happy to address any question in the end. So a quick overview about Sunrun. Sunrun is the largest residential solar installer in the United States. We have roughly 690,000 solar customers so far. We added our battery into our portfolio since 2016, And initially, our battery were positioned to mainly provide resiliency to the customer. And in 2018, we start providing customer service such as demand charge management, time of use energy arbitrage. Grid services, including resource adequacy in California, is another primary service we offer to our customer, partners, and grid. So in terms of Sunrun fleet and operation, we install solar and battery system behind the customer utility meter, and all the energy generated by the system will serve the customer load first, so reduce energy consumption from the grid. And when we dispatch the battery for grid services, in this case, responding to the CAISO energy market signal, it doesn't change the customer behavior, but it does reduce the customer observed load and utility peak demand on the aggregate level. And taking California market example, the energy storage and solar system are sited at Sunrun residential customer buildings, and the systems are designed to provide customer value in the form of resiliency during grid outage and in the form of time of use energy arbitrage in certain cases, and also can be networked together to provide an aggregated market integrated resource adequacy product. And regarding our load impact product report for 2023, the methodology we use largely remained the same as that of last year. So we built engineering model to project both the typical asset and also the aggregate fleet level output capability to provide resource adequacy, sizing for Sunrun expected fleet size needed to fulfill our contractual obligation with the utility, CCA, and LSC procurement area. So the result of this study are based on utility-specific engineering model. So we have engineer model for PGE, SCE, and STGE separately. And all these model, it is for a typical Sunrun single-family home customer with standardized behind-the-meter energy storage system that are participating in the event-based resource adequacy program during the RE window. And on the non-event day, discharging to serve other customer values such as time of use energy arbitrage. And our model assume a typical system characters based on our medium customer usage and also the average solar sizing based on our portfolio. And our model also include factors such as batteries and inverter efficiency losses. And we also reserve a 20% of all the usable battery energy at all time for customer resiliency in the event of a grid outage. And again, during non-event days, the battery is scheduled to discharge at full power at the start of peak time of use window as defined by the utility tariff. And the battery is also constrained to charge only on coincident solar power in compliance with ITC. So for this year, on top of the engineer model we use, we also include ex-post analysis based on the actual CAISO dispatch result and meter data from all of our active customer who provide event-based RA grid services in the summer of 2021 in the PGE territory. And we use Fabington day matching method. So the ex-post load reduction is the difference between the reference load and the observed load during the RA window. So I think lastly, I want to talk about, Lastly, I want to briefly touch base on SubMetering. I'm not going to get into too much details as most of the participants in this workshop are also in the CEC supply side demand response working group for the behind meter DRQC methodology. But Sunrun has been historically advocating SubMetering approach to measure the full capacity value for behind the meter solar and battery resource. But for this LIP 2023 filing, Sunrun still use the traditional load impact protocol without considering the capacity contribution for the load export portion. So I think that leads to our final recommendation for the LIP process. So we think a clear, concise, and consistent guideline is required for the application of LIP to the behind-meter batteries and hybrid system, and a greater recognition of capacity contribution of this type of resource is also needed. I think that's conclude my presentation today, and I'm happy to address any questions.
I guess I'll go first. This is Alok again from Energy Division. Can we go to slide 7? So I was a little confused here. Did you say that the non-event day TOU behavior consists of the battery discharging at full power?
Yeah, so when both in our model and daily operation, during non-event day when there's not a RA event, so we fully discharge our battery at the maximum power at the beginning of the time of use window.
But doesn't that depend on the on-site load? I mean, are you saying that if the on-site load is lower than the battery power, you just export and don't bother with you just let the battery export?
Yeah, that makes sense. So it actually depends, because for Siren portfolio, we don't have customer host load data for all the customer we have for RA services. So for customer who we do have their host load, we try to discharge the battery to offset the load to net zero. But most of our customer in California, we don't have that data. So what we do is we fully discharge the battery. So obviously, during some intervals, the customer host load is going to be smaller than the battery power. So like for those portions, so we just export to the grid.
Well, okay, so this is making me more confused here. So regardless of whether the host load is known or not, well, in most cases, it sounds like you're discharging at full power, and you're discharging it. I mean, these are 2-hour batteries, right? So you're discharging it at full power for 2 hours, and the TOU window is larger, and you're emptying the battery except for the 20% reserve.
Yeah, so let me take one step back to explain what is a normal battery operation, and now we have resource adequacy, grid services event, so how that interact with the battery operation. So when there's no grid services event, we obviously charge the battery we discharge the battery for time of use arbitrage. And because we don't have a lot of the customer host load, so we don't know how much we should discharge from the battery to offset load to zero. So instead, we just fully discharge the battery, well reserve 20% of usable energy for backup purpose. So this is for non-event day, meaning when there's no RA event, so we don't get caught by CAISO energy market. And when there is RA event, we don't discharge the battery for time of use. Instead, we preserve that energy in the battery, prepare for the RA event. And even our battery is 2 hours, like at full power, it's less than 2-hour duration, but we try to lower our power command and to extend that duration to cover the entire 4 hours window. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but it's not adding up in my mind. So let's take the case where you don't know the host load. You're discharging the battery at full rate. And so let's say in 2 hours at the start of the TOU window, you have discharged the battery down to the 20% mark. Now, on an event day, if the RA event occurs in the first 2 hours, then you have no RA capacity to deliver, according relative to the baseline.
Are you talking about the baseline? Because
Yes, I'm talking about your TOU behavior, setting up a baseline, which could be negative. And so during the array event in the same hours, you have no array capacity effectively to deliver.
so first of all, when there is an RE event, we don't do time of use discharge at all for that event day. So
But
no
that
energy.
doesn't matter, you know, that doesn't matter. You've already set a baseline
Yeah,
based on
yeah, that's my second point. So depending on what is the utility tariff that customer is on, so that time of use window, like for PG, I think typically start at 4 p.m. So we try to, like, for time of use arbitrage, we discharge the battery at 4 o'clock. So usually that time of use discharge is between 4 to 6. And for RA event, we try to respond between 5 to 9. So obviously the baseline is pretty bad for 5 and 6. So for Sunrun, we are trying to capture more value on the RA side between 6 to 9, because the 6 to 9 baseline is not impacted by the time of use discharge.
Okay, so I think, Yang, maybe we'll need to do a deeper dive in a follow-up separate session. I guess one more question for now. For the other case where you do know the host load, it sounds like you would be, in the case that the host load is less than the battery power, you would be zeroing out the host load. The net load would be 0 for the duration of the battery discharge, right?
Yes, so that's the ideal scenario. Like, we just want to fully offset the customer load. Yeah.
So I think we'll again have a problem with the array. I mean, the event day, you have a baseline of 0 and you're trying to deliver array capacity. And I guess you're going to say that you're going to do the array in the later hours. So we'll have to have a deeper dive later on. I think
Yeah, that's definitely a problem, and that's why we try to separate these two timeline, because when we do time of use discharge, it's destroy the baseline primarily between 4 to 6, and that's why for RE events we try to target 6 to 9 to deliver our full battery capability.
I see the other hand, so maybe we'll let other people ask questions.
Okay, Paul Nelson, take it away.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of Klika. Could you go to the slide that has the diagrams of the interconnection? So your interconnection of the system is on the utility side of the customer meter?
Yeah, so all of our solar panel and batteries sited behind the customer utility meter.
Between the customer's meter and the house. The utility meter in the house is where it's located then, right?
That's right.
Well, this shows it between the utilities meter and the distribution grid. So
yeah, I think here is what we think the utility meter adds, and this meter measure. So this meter we measure this inverter output. So it's, yeah, I agree.
Okay, so the star you have is the utility meter.
That's right.
Okay, I didn't know what the star meant, and I kept thinking about this, going, I don't understand how you're doing what you do, but now that the fact that you're saying that the star is the utility meter. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I think that diagram is confusing, but they're showing that they want to measure export versus self-consumption, and so that's why you need a point of metering,
right,
on what looks to be where you would expect the house meter.
Yeah. If you update this slide, I would suggest you put something that says the star. The star is the utility, meter, because that would be helpful.
Yep, that makes sense. We will make that update. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And now Stephen Costello.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about, I guess, the appropriateness of an engineering analysis. So like the LIP guidance basically says engineering analysis is very limited because of behavioral components. And I don't see that behavioral components are necessarily eliminated, and the utility or KISA doesn't have direct control, which is when the LIP guidance says engineering analysis would be okay. I guess, so why did you choose that instead of another route?
Yeah, so definitely based on the load impact protocol, the X post load reduction should be based on what is the historical performance looks like. But the problem for Siren portfolio is we just start having active customer in PGE territory providing RA services since August 2021. So we launched that program where we recruit the customer in PGE territory to fulfill our contract obligation. So that's why in this, and like in the LIP 2023, I said on top of the engineer model, we also do the ex-post analysis based on the actual meter data performance for this PGE cohort from 2021. The problem for our analysis is for SCE and SDGE territory, we didn't have any customer providing RA in 2021, so that we don't have like the actual performance data, the customer meter data to measure what is the actual load reduction looks like. And that's why we have to rely on engineering model. Basically, we simulate what is customer reference load without RA dispatch versus a simulation model based on like the observed load after we have the RA dispatch to calculate what is the projected load reduction during the RA window. But I think starting 2022, we are having active customers in both SCE and SDG territory, so that in the following year, next year LIP, if we still go with this approach, then for the entire territory, instead of using the engineer model, we are going to use just state matching baseline calculation to look at our historical performance, and using that as the base point or reference to indicate what is the ex-ante load reduction is going to be on the per customer level and from also from portfolio perspective. That makes sense?
I understand what you're saying, but do you have access to like customer data, like their usage data for SCE or San Diego? Not participants in RA, but just in general, do you have customers there in those territories?
Yeah, from Siren perspective, so when we go through sales and marketing contracting process with our customer, we obviously get their utility bill, but in terms of like for LIP analysis, we don't have their like hourly like interval meter data to do our analysis. Only like any customer who authorize, to participate in our RA program, then obviously we go through the meter, like author what is called like share my data
Green
process.
button.
Yeah, green button.
It's the scissor form.
Yes, to gather utility data. And again, last year we only actively participating in PGE territory. So that's why when we performed this analysis early this year, late last year, we just don't have any actual customer data in SCE and SDG. That's why we still include engineer model for this year analysis.
Great, and then I'll hold, but I think we should return to like Alok's questions at some point today, because I think that's a critical element. Yeah.
Yep, definitely.
All right, we have a question from Eric Lyon.
Hi, this is Eric Lyon from the CEC. I had a question sort of, I think, along the lines of Stephen's last question, and maybe this is just food for thought for the next go round. But I'm sort of wondering, as people install batteries in particular, if there's any sort of rebound effect that we should be concerned about with with these measures. I'm thinking of energy efficiency. Somebody installs a new efficient system and they keep their house 2 degrees cooler in the summer because it's that now they can sort of afford that with the new system. And so I'm wondering if there's any sort of equivalent with storage of saying, well, now I have storage, I'm not paying so much on peak. Maybe I'm actually going to run my air conditioner in a way that I wasn't before. So I think that's sort of like the behavioral components about this that I'm guessing Stephen was alluding to, that engineering analysis can't get to. So I just definitely encourage you to incorporate that into the next once there's more data about customer behavior to work with.
Yeah, Eric, I think that makes sense when we have more customer data. So then we can compare what is the pre and post intervention looks like for this behavior. But also I would say Siren ultimately control the battery dispatch, and especially before the RE program, we always, like in California market, when the customer is on TOU rate, we discharge their battery to capture that benefit. So what we are trying to do here is basically, instead of doing time of use discharge during the event day, when we have an RE event, we shift the energy from the battery to the RE window. So what I'm trying to say is, from customer behavior perspective, they don't feel a difference between TOU arbitrage and RE event. And so like the behavior you mentioned may not be realized, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's just something we're going to have to, keep an eye out for in the data once it's there. I could see it going both ways, but I think it's important to realize that, even though the battery is a very controllable, firm resource, how a customer responds to that might be very different.
Yep, that makes sense.
All right, thank you very much. And last, but certainly not least, we have Southern California Edison to present on their local capacity requirement contracts.
Okay, does everybody have the screen? Takes me a minute to get my stuff situated. Levels balanced there. Hi, this is Dan Hansen at Christensen Associates in lovely Madison, Wisconsin, doing a study on behalf of SCE. Get over here. So what I'm going to talk about is the outcomes for 3 demand response aggregators that had active contracts with SCE during 2021, abbreviated as hybrid STEM and NRG. Those DRAs enrolled C&I customers to provide demand response within SCE service territory, actually all within the LA Basin LCA. And they nominated individual customers on a monthly basis. SCE is then responsible for dispatching those contracts according to the terms of the contracts, which limit duration and hours and frequency, et cetera. And then the DRA is responsible for going back to their customers to make sure they meet their contract obligations. Outside of the ex post analysis, but included in the ex ante study, are 2 additional DRAs that have contracts beginning in 2022 or 2023, and that's Swell Energy and Sunrun. So the capacity varies a bit by hour. It was the same during the entire analysis period. You'll see for most of the day, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., it's at 75 megawatts. But as we get further into the resource adequacy window hours, starting at 19 and through 21, the capacities drop off a bit, as low as 53.5 by 8 to 9 p.m. The methodology is familiar, at least with respect to one or two of these evaluations. We estimate customer-specific regression models with the customer's hourly usage as the dependent variable. And the objective that we have is to then simulate reference loads that serve as the thing that would have happened in the absence of the event. The explanatory variables we have, skipping down a bit, we've got sort of the regular pattern variables, so hour of day, day of week, and we'll have separate hour of day shapes for Mondays and Fridays, and then a common shape for the middle of the week, and month of year. We've got temperatures expressed in a few different ways, current hour, average daily, maximum daily, and then there are also some interactions of current hour with each of average daily and maximum daily temperature. And as we've done in many of these studies in the past, we include what we call a morning load variable, which is just the average load through about 10 a.m. And what that does, the way I like to think about it is if you have something like an industrial customer that might have days with more active processes than others, it helps kind of set the level for the day. Like this, is this a high usage day or a low usage day? And in practice, that variable functions in much the same way as a day of adjustment in something like a 10 and 10 baseline. The time period of our analysis and the data included start in November 2020 and end in September 2021. We'd usually use a program year starting in October of the prior year, but October of 2020 was included in the previous analysis, so we didn't want to redo it here. We exclude all event hours, and then at least 3 hours following the event. If the event starts late enough, we kick out the whole rest of the day. The idea is we have enough events happening that we need to retain some pre-event hour data in these models. We don't think there's anything about this program that affects usage prior to the event, but we do want to exclude some data from after the event because there might be some snapback happening. We exclude data if we happen to have it prior to the first time we see the customer nominated. That just ensures that whatever measures they have in place in terms of storage are actually there. So if they're using it, the battery storage on non-event days to help manage peak period usage, that is happening and is properly incorporated into the analysis. For validation, we estimate a set of models where we kick out some of the data, about 12%, just randomly selected, and then we see how well we predict out of sample on those days and make adjustments as needed. Try to have a very light hand on those adjustments, not engage in any sort of regression hunting on these things. The model worked out pretty well. We can also, for one of these providers, we can look at our estimated impacts against MGO settlement data, which directly meters battery output, and see that we're doing pretty well along those lines. And then the load impacts that we report are just, as we've seen, the model's predicted load minus what we're observing in that hour. So this is one look at ex-post results. I would say, so for these 3 contracts that we had active during this period, they're actually, across those contracts, there are about 23 different dispatchable units that can be called. And there can be a lot of calls. The ones that are called the most are called over 200 times during that 11-month period, and calls can't happen on weekends. So it's a lot of days of the available ones. And when resources are called on the same day, they aren't always called for the same hours. So reporting is a little bit messy to get something that's sort of apples to apples to compare. But we were able to find these, I think it's 12 days, that have at least a subset of hours over which all 23 of these dispatchable units was called. You'll see ranging from like 5 p.m. on the early end to 8 p.m. on the late end. We lose a few customers as we go through the summer, from 330 down to 325, but pretty stable. These contract amounts don't actually change over time, but recall that the contract amounts decline a bit as we get into the evening hours. So you'll see that the early end of the window, like 5 to 7, has a higher average across that window, 66.8. Then you'll see at the later end, 6 to 8, where it's 58.5. Reference loads, which is just the total load we think would have happened in the absence of the event across all these customers, ranges, from about 149-ish megawatts to high 160s. And the load impacts averaged across the event window are usually in the 60s. Sometimes we get into the 70s. And expressed as a percentage of the reference load, low to mid 40s is an outcome. And then expressed as the average contract quantity, they're overachieving on average. That could include some hours with overachievement and some hours with underachievement. But on average, across the 2 or 3 hour periods, they're providing more impacts than the contract required. So this slide zooms in on an hourly basis to one of those data points. So this is the July 28th day, and this blue shaded period are those hours we summarized in the previous slide. That's when all the resources were called. The surrounding green hours had some assets called or some IDs called, but not all of them. What we're looking at, this orange line represents just the metered loads. This dashed black line is our estimated hourly impacts. And then the blue line is the load we think would have happened in the absence of the event, which is just adding these impacts back into the observed loads. And I've highlighted here in block form the total contract quantity across all of these resources. So you'll see in this first full hour ending 18, the load impact is right about at what we have for the contract quantity. They're over providing in hour 19, and then in 20, again, you're pretty close. I don't have it adjusted in hours 17 and 21 to have the contract quantity be associated with just the resources called, so you can't really make a judgment there of how they're performing relative to their requirements. Guess a couple things to point out. You will see some snapback here. Wrong signed impact, I guess, wrong signed. Positive loads increases in the post-event hours. A little bit of degradation in the impact as the event goes on. And you'll see just a hint here of some notching during peak hours that happens in the reference load, reflecting some use of the battery storage during event days, non-event days, sorry. I will move on to ex-ante analysis, maybe plow through the questions later. For ex-ante, instead of any sort of enrollment forecast, we get monthly capacity commitments as forecast by SCE. This is just what's under contract for the coming months and years for each one of them. It's up to the DRAs to backfill with the customers needed to meet those commitments. So it's the capacity commitment itself that's the important thing to scale to, not the number of customers served. We do simulate customer-specific reference loads for all the required ex-ante scenarios, so 1 in 2 and 1 in 10s and all that stuff. They're not really hooked up to anything. You'll see that the customer load impacts come from a different source, so they help provide a scale to things, but we aren't applying something like a percentage impact to them. So they're just... On the load impact side, we do separate things for the contracts that were included in the ex-post study versus those that will be joining the program or starting up in this year and next. For those in the ex-post study, what we do is really just a straightforward translation of the ex-post estimates we have. We do have a lot of data for the most part to look through. Again, there can be a couple hundred events for some of these customers. And we don't see, and we don't think it makes sense that there would be any significant weather effect on load impacts. So we don't need to statistically model how those impacts need to be adjusted for ex-post to all the various ex-ante weather conditions. As much as possible, we try to line up the impact required during the RA window with the impact that we're pulling and summarizing over from ex-post. So for example, in hour ending 17, we're going to pull on or derive it from hour ending 17 impacts that are the first hour of an event to the extent possible. If the first hour is 18, we might pull that instead. We do, as the RA window goes on, factor in this sort of degradation of impact as the window goes on. So when we get to hour ending 20, we're usually looking at 4th hours of events in historical data. So it's basically whatever happened in ex post is going to be reflected in ex ante because of the data we're choosing to average over in these impacts. And so we can use the most data possible. We build them up from dispatch ID level estimates. So that is, we don't only limit ourselves to data where everything within a contract was called, because that would reduce the amount of data available to us. We look at when that dispatch ID was called. We'll grab all the hour ending 17s that dispatch ID was called, regardless of how well it overlaps with another dispatch ID within the same contract. I would note that the contracts we're modeling have a maximum 4-hour event duration, whereas the RA window is 5 hours long. Don't think there's a perfect way to deal with this. What we've chosen to do here is to basically stretch our 4-hour impacts into 5 hours. So we kind of take the middle of the event and stretch it out into 2 hours so that when you look at the hourly RA window impacts, what you're getting is a reasonable impact for what would happen if that RA window hour was an event. The trade-off there is that if you look at the average impact across all RA window hours, you're a little bit overstated because in reality, not all 5 of those hours could be an event. It's a pretty easy adjustment though. You can just pick out an event hour and average in something pretty close to 0. We had the good fortune that the forecast contract quantities didn't change, at least until the contract went away and went to 0. So we didn't need to make any adjustment for differences between ex post and ex ante contract quantities. For the contracts that aren't in the ex post study, we really don't have anything to go on. There's no load data, there's no historical performance. So we've done the same thing that was done in the previous 2 evaluations, which is to apply an assumed percentage to the contract value. So whenever we're summarizing just an RA window average, it'll include those contracts. When I show an hourly outcome in a couple slides from now, these contracts won't be included because we don't have any hourly information for them. These are the forecast contract quantities by month going through 2025. It happens that 2025 is the peak year. That's when the quantities are at their highest. And after that point, contracts begin expiring, as you'll sort of see in the next slide. So sort of growing in the next 4 years as contracts are added in and capabilities are increased. This shows the average RA window impact for all the resources combined, including those that weren't in the ex post study. These groups of bars here reflect the 4 different weather scenarios required in ex ante. As I said, we don't do anything with that. There's no weather sensitivity, so this just sort of emphasizes the point that they're all the same. And again, you'll see that the impact is growing up into 2025, tails off just a tiny bit in 2026. And then starts dropping off in subsequent years as contracts begin to expire. So in 2022, we're looking at about 60 megawatts. We're peaking in 25 at maybe 78 megawatts and dropping off to just under 10 megawatts by the end of the forecast period. Here's a look at the August peak day for 2022. I guess what you'll see here, and again, this won't include the new contracts in there. You'll notice here that we do have that degradation over the RA window and the impact. The impact is higher early on than later on. And again, just a little hint of notching here that might indicate use of the battery on non-event days as well. So pretty similar looking to the ex post figure. That is what I have. Any questions? Let me take a look here at the chat.
Yeah, we got a hand raised from Paul.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Dan. This is Paul from on behalf of Klika. I think you had the ex post had some snapback effects, but I'm not seeing that in the ex ante.
Yeah, we didn't model that into ex ante. We could. It wouldn't.
It looked pretty significant. I mean, it's pretty sizable.
It's not, I mean, by the time you get 2 hours after, yeah, it's not nothing. In the immediate, right here in hour 22, I mean, really consider that hour 21 is really the snapback hour for many of the resources, or at least some subset of the resources. 22 is definitely a post-event hour, and there's not a ton of snapback there, but 23 and 24, it is more significant. Yeah, if this is sort of consistent with the methodology we inherited a couple of years ago, that we didn't model in the snapback, but we certainly could.
Well, is the snapback happening because the battery starts charging?
Dan Ceballos, do you have any information on that?
That is correct, Alok.
Oh,
So,
isn't that an easy problem to solve?
In the context of resource adequacy, the 24-hour slice proposal, batteries are supposed to show where they're getting their energy from, the capacity to charge the batteries for battery storage. So underlying the similar context here, if there's significant snapback in that hour ending 23, hour ending 24, potentially then if you had this as is showing it for RA, that would then get added to the energy requirement that you'd have to show capacity for.
Fair enough, but isn't that happening in like 2024? That's not a this year thing.
It's not a this year thing, but going forward, at some point in time, would probably, at least for this one I'm looking at, probably want to look at the ex ante results would be want to include the snapback.
Right.
For implementation if they go for the 24-hour lease flights a day.
So I guess, Paul, you're just making a point to think about in the future, right?
Yep, I'm always trying to look ahead, Luke.
Understood. So if I can, did you have any other question or can I go now?
No, that's it.
Okay, so hi, this is Alok in Energy Division. A couple of questions, Dan, but thank you for the presentation. I guess it's about a rigorous analysis that we have seen. I just want to make sure that the baseline that you're using to determine the load impact, well, let me back up. I assume these batteries are normally doing demand charge management, and that they're not doing TOU arbitrage. And I guess I'm trying to get to what have you assumed in the baseline for non-event days? Does that factor in the demand charge activity of the battery?
Right, so whatever use they're making of the battery to affect their net load on non-event days should affect the reference load. So for example, if the battery is dispatched on all non-event days, that would tend to reduce the event hour load impact if that dispatch occurs during event hours on those non-event days. So the only potentially complicating factor is that when we get to very high frequency dispatch contracts, we don't have as much information about the customer's behavior during certain hours of the day when events aren't happening. But whatever information we have, we're incorporating in the estimates. And if they were notching out due to battery use every single day at the same time period, you would see that notch in the reference load and it would reduce the load impact by the same amount.
Understood. Okay, thank you. So the another question is on slide 4, you were showing this drop off in capacity later in the window. I guess that's a function of what you have contracted. But on slide 7, you show a fairly wide margin between reference load and the actual load impact. So why are we dropping in the later in the window? I mean,
Dan, do you want to?
I guess I thought that the reference load is dropping later in the window, but it seems like there's plenty of margin here.
So Dan Ceballos from Edison. So some of these contracts have different megawatt commitments over the course of the day. And that's a factor of the type of customers that are in the portfolio of the aggregator. And so like if an aggregator had a bunch of CNI customers whose normal load was providing a resource from say 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., they could provide more of a load drop. And then what they negotiated in their contract was a reduced amount for the later hours, still providing some resource, but less in the evening or after hours versus the normal business hours. That makes sense?
I see. Okay. Thank you. So my last question is, I just wanted to confirm on slide 12, your projected ex ante. Did you say that is including the Sunrun and Swell contracts or not?
So slide 12 just shows the contract quantities. This isn't the load impacts themselves, and these do include the new contracts that are being added in. And then these load impacts on slide 13, this figure does include the 2 new contracts, whereas this hourly example does not.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Another hand. Let's look.
Yeah, any other questions?
Looks like Peter and Jill, are those chat questions something you want addressed, or do you want to unmute and talk through them?
Alok had the same question and it was answered.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
And Peter's question was more of a comment from a sidebar chat.
Okay, got it. Harder to process when I'm presenting versus just watching others.
No, yeah, you're all good. All right, well, hearing none, I'll say we can open up questions now to basically anyone who wants to ask any of the DRP's questions along the lines, maybe some of the earlier DRPs that got the benefit of the doubt, not having everyone fully awake. So are there any lingering questions for any of the presenters today?
Yeah, I guess I have one question for Leap. And it's possible it got answered, but I had to step out for a few minutes. So can we get Leap back on? I guess that was Karen, right?
I'm currently on.
Hi there.
I may be able to answer it. If
Okay,
Karen
well,
is out, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's fine. I can't really hear you, so you might want to do something about your microphone. But the question was, I remember Karen talking about during events, a subset of meters being dispatched, something like that. And I guess I was looking to clarify, if a resource ID is called, I mean, it sounded like Karen was saying that when a resource ID is called, a subset of the meters are responding. And so that's what I wanted to clarify. Why would that happen? I mean, I would expect all the meters to respond when a resource ID is dispatched, no?
No, that was confusion. The confusion was whether I think Karen was talking about how customers aren't dispatched monolithically, as in everybody within a sublab, for example, because they're dispatched by resource ID. We got data on everybody in every resource that was dispatched. There were no discrepancies or non-participation issues. There's no, hiding the ball. In other words, that wasn't what we intended to communicate.
Okay. And then another question I remember is she made the comment that most of the portfolio was not dependent on temperature. And she gave examples like pumping and batteries. Now, in the case of the battery, the load impact is dependent on the baseline, and the baseline could be sensitive to temperature dependent loads on site. So it wasn't obvious to me that the battery would necessarily be temperature independent. So can you comment on that? I mean,
Yes.
Go
So
ahead.
those resources are commercial EV charging facilities. So there really aren't loads other than EVs being charged. So the question would be whether there's a seasonal or somehow temperature dependent pattern in how many customers are charging EVs at any given time, basically, right? Because that's what determines those facility loads. And it is true that batteries can store, different amounts of energy depending on whether it's very cold or warm. And obviously there's going to be patterns in driving and how busy, these different sites are. But, if you just take the data for what it is and you look for a temperature effect, it's not in evidence. So that was the basis of that comment. But it's a much more load type it's a much more narrow load type that the meters are seeing at those facilities, because they're not like buildings with HVAC and manufacturing and all kinds of other stuff going on. It's literally just cars charging. That's what is behind the meter.
I see. So the battery segment in the portfolio represents EV batteries as opposed to batteries sitting on site discharging and offsetting load.
There are also commercially hosted batteries. That is actually true.
Okay, so the two categories are then presumably analyzed differently, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other last minute questions before we finish the workshop? I see a question from Nawar. Oh, more like an answer. Do you want to read it or would you like me to?
Oh, yeah, I was just commenting on the, could you have a separate, some customers dispatched? And I mean, yeah, you can. If you're not, like, if they're like in DRAM, I think there are limitations on number of resource IDs you can have. So you could have different customer groups that are set to curtail at different levels. There are different device, like device vendors that have different acceptable number of dispatches. So it's not inconceivable that you wouldn't have every customer and a resource ID dispatched.
If that's a strategy, it would really make it hard to determine the capacity potential of that resource ID, right?
It is, and that's kind of what happens when you try to make a disparate group of disparate aggregation and really in detail model it as a generator. So I don't think it's a very common strategy, but you're allowed to do it.
Well, I agree you're allowed to do it, but I guess if you have customers with different marginal costs, let's say, you would think that they would be separated into different resource IDs.
Yeah, except for in DRAM where you can only have a certain number of resource IDs per sub app, or if you need that, they're not 100 kW. So if the different customer groups aren't 100 kW, then you might need to combine them. But okay. I agree, it's like, it's not, I'm not saying that it's a complicated strategy.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for that. And with that last comment, I think we are done with this workshop. So thank you all for attending today's Demand Response Provider and SCE's LCR Load Impact Protocols workshop. So if you have any questions about the workshop or the material today, please feel free to contact me at andrew.mcgee, that's M-A-G-I-E, at cpuc.ca.gov. And I guess I'll see you all next year. So have a good day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.